So I'd like to just begin by saying two thank yous. The first is to Dr. Abramson for staying up late and both the clearly and cogently well-prepared lectures that you've shared with us up until this point. They have really been super well received, and we really appreciate both your scholarship and your dedication. And again, you're staying up late, but really it has been such a pleasure for all of us to have a chance to learn from you, learn with you, and benefit from your incredible scholarship and your beautiful and lucid presentation. So I wanted to begin by thanking Dr. Abramson. I want to continue actually by thanking everyone who's on the call, thanking all of our community members who really bring a level of engagement, of excitement, of interest, of probing and insightful questions, especially the ones that are forwarded to me that I'm able to share at the end of the talk. And it's just on Zoom, but the fact that we get to come together and it really just speaks so well about our community, that these are the things for which we come together. And these are the things that the types of experiences that we share with each other. It's something about which we should be all very proud, that these are the kind of things that in ways that we spend our time and express our values. So again, of course, a big yesher koach and thank you to Dr. Abramson. This is going to be the final lecture of this series. And I know you've whet our appetite, and we hopefully will be able to learn with you and from you in the future. But also, again, a thank you to all the community members for making this community exactly what it is. And with that, I'll hand it over for our third lecture to Dr. Abramson.
Well, thank you very much for that really kind introduction. It's been a pleasure for me to speak with you. Yeah, seems like such a motivated and intelligent audience. I really enjoyed the brief moments that we have shared in debate, and I hope you'll have some useful but not too difficult questions for me at the end of tonight's talk. So let me just share my screen and we'll get right to the material. This is a classic painting of Moses Mendelssohn on the left. He's going to be a very important figure in our discussion today with Lessing and Lavater. Very fascinating challenge of the 17th century, but I'm going to 18th century. I'm going to jump past that right now. Tonight, we are going to conclude our discussion of the triangular conflict that shaped much of modernity. In the last 2 weeks, we spent a lot of time talking about the incredible Hasidic revolution, the roots of that revolution and what it portended for Eastern European Jewry. We spoke about the rather harsh reaction from the Misnagdim, from the so-called opponents of the Hasidim, and even the name itself, mitnaged or misnaged in a Yiddish pronunciation, refers to how the traditionalists, led by the Vilna Gaon, defined themselves by their opposition to the Hasidic movement. And so these two revolutions, so to speak, kind of fed off one another. Today, we're going to speak about the entry of the third simultaneous intellectual spiritual revolution that affected the Jews of Eastern and East Central Europe, and see how the mix of these three groups really came together to form a broad swath of Jewish identities that are prevalent even in today's Jewish politics. So let me start by going to the root of the Haskalah, which we only touched on briefly in the last two lectures. The term Haskalah, it's related to the word for intelligence, and it was used as a translation for the German term Aufklärung, which is, or enlightenment in English, which was the popular term used to describe this kind of movement that illuminated much of Western Europe in the 18th century. Figures like Immanuel Kant, for example, and the political ideas of Rousseau and Voltaire and others. And it contributed to this idea of an increasing emphasis on humanism, on the power of a human being, specifically a man, because they had not quite made it to consider women in the same category as men, but nevertheless still strides forward in that regard. That men could somehow be the arbiters of truth, that they could be the locus of truth, and they could translate that somehow into the political, social, and even the personal sphere. If I can give you just one example, the Lockean concept of tabula rasa emerges out of the Enlightenment. Tabula rasa meaning the blank slate, the idea that human beings are born like devoid of any data, like a slate, like a blackboard is devoid of any writing. And whatever you write on that tender child's soul, in terms of exposing them to education and experiences and so on, that's what will create the perfect human being. This kind of idea of the tabula rasa and the potential that it represented was at the beating heart of the Enlightenment and also of the Haskalah. And when it encountered the Hasidic movement and the Misnagdic movement, there was quite an eruption, because not all three movements saw this tabula rasa in exactly the same way. Let us, though, go back a little bit in time and explore some of the Jewish intellectual roots of the Haskalah. We could actually spend the entire lecture just exploring this easily, but I'm going to pick out two figures, for example. One of my favorites is a rather amazing figure named Azaria del Rossi, who lived in northern Italy in the 16th century. In many ways, not a very talented person. He was essentially a proofreader for the emerging publishing industry. He was a copyist. But it happened that in 1570, there was a dramatic earthquake in Ferrara, and he fled with much of the Jewish community that lived actually in a lowland very close to the river. And, they were worried about their buildings collapsing. So they actually spent a couple of weeks living outdoors, a little bit like my shul during the COVID condition. They spent a couple of weeks living outdoors with the non-Jewish citizens of Ferrara in an unusual kind of environment where all of a sudden, they're all in the same boat. They're worried about what will happen to their city during this literally tectonic change. And Del Rossi struck up a friendship with some of the Christian monks who were out there at the time. And they were exchanging all kinds of ideas. And this led to kind of an epiphany, to borrow a Christian term, for Del Rossi. He ended up writing a very important work called Me'ir Einayim, the Enlightener of Eyes. And it really took a different approach to the entire way that Jews appreciated the world. It was a tremendously dramatic work because of two things. First of all, Del Rossi really had a very wide open idea when it came to what science could tell us about Torah. He did not have that kind of, instinctive rejection that we see in the church about challenges to the Ptolemaic view of the universe, with the earth at the center and the sun revolving around it. He simply said, wow, look at this. I bet there are a lot of things that we could get from science that would help us learn about the Torah. The specific connotation, by the way, was he wrote a study of earthquakes in Jewish history, starting from Tanakh and moving forward, which was really quite a fascinating thing. The second thing that was really important about Del Rossi, perhaps even more important for our purposes, is that he was completely willing to engage in frank and open dialogue with Christians. And this was something that was not as common as one would think, even in the 16th century, even after the Renaissance and so on. In many ways, we can see this trend going back much further. We see it, for example, in Maimonides' famous comment that occurs in his introduction to Pirkei Avot, called the 8 chapters. We should accept truth from whoever speaks it, perhaps anticipating the huge challenge that his Guide for the Perplexed and even his Mishnah Torah would meet. He speaks in the 8 chapters about how he, compiled his commentary based on rabbinic sources and scriptural sources and even philosophers, and meaning Jewish and non-Jewish thinkers, because you have to accept truth from whoever speaks it. And these two ideas, the implications of modern science as understood within an Enlightenment kind of framework of the grand possibility of figuring out everything in a Newtonian model, where if we just get the laws of the universe right, we will be able to figure out everything that ever happens in history in the future as well. And at the same time, this kind of community of scholars, this ideal of the tolerant university in which Jews could exchange in the marketplace of ideas with the same facility as non-Jews. That's something that Del Rossi embodied. And these are kind of values that, again, we can trace these much further back in Jewish history, but they become especially important in the 18th century, and they're associated with the Haskalah. Let us not forget one other element, which I touched on in the first lecture, and I personally happen to be quite fascinated with lately, the impact of the Portuguese diaspora, which is shown in this map here. You will recall from that first lecture a couple of weeks ago that Portuguese Jews were typically Jews who had been forced to convert to Christianity, either in their first generation or for subsequent generations later. And they were artificially constrained by the Inquisition that was especially fierce in Portugal. But once they got out of Portugal, they essentially used their Christian driver's licenses to get a full pass into secular culture. And even though when they got to more hospitable climes like Amsterdam, for example, or New Amsterdam as well, here in New York City, they could, shed their external Christian identity and resume their Jewish identity. By the time that happened, they may have been 2, 3, 4 generations deep in Christian education, having gone to university, having studied Christian thought, and having a somewhat attenuated idea of Jewish values, norms, history, and so on. So they're walking around with a totally different intellectual bag of tricks than your typical Jews in Europe. And they're spreading a lot of fascinating ideas, many of them deeply challenging to the Jewish status quo, people like Spinoza, who we spoke about in the first lecture. So these things are coming together, and in the 18th century, we see them expressed so well and so powerfully in this thing called the Haskalah. Now, definitely the hero, someone who's called the grandfather of the Haskalah, is Moses Mendelssohn, shown here. Moses of Dessau, as he was originally known. He was something of a child prodigy. He came to Berlin, where he made much of his fame, and he distinguished himself in so many areas of intellectual inquiry. First and foremost, because he was able to shed the Yiddish tinged German that most Jews spoke. That is, their Yiddish was, overwhelmed their German skills, and they frequently, were parodied as country bumpkins speaking some kind of bizarre, old historic form of German with a lot of strange words in it. But he learned, the Hochdeutsch, the really refined, perfect contemporary German. And not only that, he was quite an able philosopher. He was able to actually enter the salons of the day and impress everyone for the sobriety of his thought, the expansiveness of his comprehension, and his fluency with the written materials. And I mean, it sounds strange to us now, speaking in the 21st century, but in the late 18th century, this was like, some feral child wandering out of the woods and suddenly, getting a tenured full professorship as one of the greatest universities. So he was like a cause célèbre, and for many, he was viewed as the possibility of Jews for full emancipation into Western society. He was kind of like the poster child for the very idea that Jews could have equal civil rights, that they could enter into society, they could have full privileges as German citizens, which they were not. And in fact, they would not achieve that until late in the 19th century. And in fact, a little further east in Russia, they wouldn't get it until the early 20th century. So Moses Mendelssohn stood for a lot of these forward-thinking ideas. And amazingly, he did it without jettisoning his Jewish identity. Now, you will notice from the portrait here, he was clean shaven, which was a little bit scandalous for the era. Jews, traditionalist Jews were usually bearded, that is males, obviously. Although there were and are halakhically permissible ways to shave the beard, it was definitely not the kind of way that Jews would look in Eastern Europe at the time. This was considered, and he was considered a Deutscher, a German, meaning he was hopelessly assimilated to Western values, but he never let go of the core observances of Judaism, and he considered himself an Orthodox Jew, although that term was not coined at the time. It wouldn't be coined till a good half century after his death. He considered himself essentially an observant Jew in all ways. One of the sad aspects of Mendelssohn's life is that he was unable to provide this kind of sophisticated articulation of both a Jewish and a civic German identity to his grandchildren, all of whom adopted Christian lifestyles. But nevertheless, for his generation and for his time, he was essentially an observant Jew who had imbibed the greatest thought circulating in Western Europe at the time, and was essentially saying to German society, hey, you should think about how you treat your Jews, because we have tremendous potential to contribute to society, and we can only really get there if, for example, you allow us to attend university. He was completely self-taught. If you allow us to, pursue the occupations that are currently closed to Jews, and so on. So he's kind of like the grandfather of the Haskalah. But at the same time, we should also be aware that there were other figures, like, for example, Solomon Maimon, who is just a little bit younger than Mendelssohn, and in fact looked up to Mendelssohn as his mentor in many ways. Solomon Maimon was a very talented philosopher. He debated quite successfully with Immanuel Kant, and he duplicated a lot of the strengths that Mendelssohn had. However, unlike Mendelssohn, he certainly was not observant, and he took pride in this. Maimon did write quite a few philosophical treatises that had some popularity and notoriety in his day, but his longest lasting contribution to Western thought is his rather salacious autobiography, which is it is not the first in this genre, but it is certainly one of the most important, the so-called OTD genre, the off the derech genre. Maimon himself came from a Misnagdic background in Lithuania. He was, like Mendelssohn, a child prodigy and very learned in the Talmud, and he achieved great status for his impoverished family because of his, rabbinic learning and skills. Married off at the age of 11, which was not that uncommon for especially talented rabbinic youth at that age. Very unhappy marriage, especially an unhappy relationship with his domineering mother-in-law. And so at age 13, he ran away from home. He ran away actually from his own home, abandoned his wife, and in fact did not give her a get for a decade. Also abandoned his child as well, young David, who would only meet him years later in Berlin. So Solomon Maimon left Lithuania. He had actually a sort of a detour to Mezrich, excuse me, a detour to Mezrich, where he met Dov Ber, the Maggid of Mezrich, and he has a fascinating chapter about his encounter with Hasidism. But ultimately, he felt that Hasidism was, albeit more inspired and more remarkable for its devotion and its enthusiasm, it was essentially what he regarded as the same kind of nonsense that he had imbibed as a Talmudist, and he just wanted to put that all behind him. He came to northern Germany. He was in Berlin. He was associated with Mendelssohn, got up to all kinds of trouble, visited brothels and so on. And his autobiography is very entertaining reading, but personally, I don't think of him as a very likable individual. But he's also the face of the Haskalah, because unlike Mendelssohn, who said that, we can be Jews and be good Germans and be good modern citizens of Europe, we can have it all. Solomon Maimon said, chuck it over the side. Like, there's so many of these books nowadays, or the TV series on Netflix, Unorthodox and things like that. It's a long tradition of off the derech, or over the convent walls, so to speak, types of literature. And that's the version of the Haskalah that was also active at the very same time. This will be especially significant when the movement begins to bleed over into Eastern European regions. So the Haskalah in Eastern Europe, just to give you, in Western Europe, excuse me, just to give you a sense of like the kind of issues that they were facing, and the kind of solutions that they were looking for, and why the Haskalah was so significant in Western Europe. In the late 18th century, there was a false burial scare that actually lasted for about half a century. The consensus of scientific opinion at the time was that it was impossible to definitively define death by cessation of respiration and heart activity. And that, in fact, a person could stop breathing, as far as 18th century devices were able to measure, and the heartbeat could not be detected, but the person could still be alive and then wake up sometime later. So this was kind of like a mania that circulated around Europe. It also reached the shores of America, and the invention of a safety coffin was actually, I did a little bit of research on this before the lecture. Apparently, America approved almost 90 patents for different kinds of safety coffins, specifically for this reason. And there's actually a word which I forgot that specifically describes the phobia of being buried alive. At any rate, and you can see in this particular version, on the left is our dearly departed, who has been buried underground in his coffin, but then, and there's this structure that extends from the coffin up to the surface of the graveyard, with this flag that looks a little bit like a mailbox flag. And on the right hand, you see in this picture, he's woken up from his coma-like trance. He's not actually dead, but he has been, falsely buried. And so he operates this little winch that frees the flag and has it, pop up in the air. Hopefully so that people walking by the graveyard will see that flag flying in the air, and they'll have a chill run down their spine, and then immediately they go out there with shovels and rescue him before he can expire a second time. There are also versions of this that had like bells and strings attached to it. There is a widely held belief, it's probably not true, but that the phrase "saved by the bell" refers to the ringing of such bells on safety coffins so that people would come and rescue a person. That "saved by the bell" though probably comes from the boxing ring, where you're at the end of a round and you're about to be knocked out, but the bell rings the end of the round, so you get to go back for another one. At any rate, why is this relevant to the Haskalah? So when Duke Friedrich of Mecklenburg-Schwerin, which is in northern Germany, heard about these things, he was quite taken with it, and he decided to go along and take the progressive scientific position and say that in Germany, or in the regions that he controlled, no one could be buried until 72 hours had elapsed after the death was confirmed. So in other words, they would make sure, for sure, that a person was dead before they interred him. And this was a tremendous affront to Jewish burial practices, which, of course, inspired by their Middle Eastern origins, argued for almost immediate burial, ideally within the first 24 hours of death. And there are all these ideas in the Talmud that speak about the nivul hames, the desecration of the corpse. If it's left alone, if it begins to rot, God forbid, it should be interred as soon as possible. So the rabbis were very upset about this issue, and they went to Moses Mendelssohn for a solution. They said, "You've got to help us out here because, you know, the Duke is going to impose something on Jewish practice that is so different than what we've done for the last 1800 years. We can't have it." So Mendelssohn took two distinct positions, which is quite fascinating. On the one hand, he argued to the secular authorities, the Duke and others, that the Jews should be allowed to maintain their traditional burial practices, that they had had no instances of false burials, and they, you know, this is a religious thing, that they should be respected and so on. But to his Jewish compatriots, he said, why don't we do what the Duke said? Why? Because it's science. It makes sense. We should do this. Because don't forget, Mendelssohn was also a product of his time and also had the same concerns of the scientific community of the era. And so privately with other rabbis, he said, you know what, I think we should probably do this. Now, lest you object to say, how could he, as an Orthodox Jew, you know, propose such a radical change to Jewish burial practice? The truth is, he was really arguing, he was saying we should go back to a much earlier Jewish practice. It's not very well known, but in fact, in much of the Talmudic period and the Mishnaic period, Jews did essentially practice a kind of a dual burial system where the bodies would first be interred, and then after a period of time, like typically a year, then the bones would actually be disinterred and they would be brought to family crypts like this one in Italy. There are such crypts that exist in Beit Shan, in northern Israel, and in a few places in Israel, in Italy, where we have these ancient catacombs that are clearly Jewish, marked with menorahs and things like that. And so essentially he was saying, why don't we just readopt an ancient practice, which is described in the Talmudic small tractate called Smachot. Why don't we just go back to that practice? That way we'll be good with science and good with Judaism. This got him in a lot of hot water with, among others, Rav Yaakov Emden, who was dead set against any kind of innovation. But nevertheless, this is a typically kind of maskilic way to do things, saying, well, you know, we can appreciate science and we can also appreciate tradition. We just have to look a little more deeply into tradition to find the way we can get through this. And so by trying to respect modern knowledge, which was evolving through its scientific revolutions, and also respect the Torah, but not necessarily respect the tradition in the sense of the customary behaviors, what we would call in Hebrew minhagim, things which are not necessarily rooted in scriptural commands or even the Talmud and the Mishnah, but rather, you know, customs that had sort of like attached themselves by the dint of Jewish choices over generations that would result in things like, modes of dress and I mentioned beards and things like that, that were, you know, more regional kind of traditions. The Haskalah, under thinkers like Mendelssohn, said we should carefully examine the corpus of Judaism, and we should surgically remove, or at least isolate, those elements that are not part of the body and soul itself, but rather things like the externalities. Like, for example, do we really have to wear those kaftans everywhere? Those long coats that go below our knees? I mean, I know we've been wearing them for a few hundred years, but really? Why don't we just wear these newfangled short jackets like the Germans do? And we can go on and on listing the many different ways in which the tradition could be altered for the sake of Haskalah. That's the kind of position that people like Moses Mendelssohn took. And the second element, which is very important, besides the role of science with Torah and tradition, is that Mendelssohn trusted and wanted to engage with civic leaders like the Duke of Mecklenburg-Schwerin. He felt that, you know, for too long, Jews had regarded the non-Jewish world as toxic, as antithetical to Jewish values and as hostile to Jewish values. And he felt, no, we should, while recognizing that there are a minority of non-Jews who unfortunately don't like Jews because they are not sufficiently educated as to who Jews are and what we stand for, we should nevertheless embrace our non-Jewish neighbors with open arms and, be happy to join with them in the exalted experiment of constructing a multi-ethnic society. And so the idea of openness to the German population in particular was a distinguishing feature of the Western Haskalah. But remember, we've got a whole range. We had the Mendelssohn, who was kind of like the middle of the road person in many ways. We have the off the derech Maimon, who was also in this camp, who was also saying, what are you even trying to keep the Torah here? Just get rid of it. And then we have people like Mendelssohn's, one of his prime students. Here he is, David Friedlander, from his years are 1750 to 1834. And we should realize that Mendelssohn's plan simply was not working. His idea of demonstrating the value of Jews to German society would naturally result in the conference of emancipation and equal rights to them. In reality, as much as the Jews tried desperately to show that they deserved emancipation, it eluded them at every turn. And this drove the Jews to an almost ape-like, slavish imitation of German norms. For example, the reorganization of the synagogue layout to make it more church-like. And in fact, one movement in Germany argued that, hey, maybe one of the reasons why we're not like meshing with the Germans is because we observe the Sabbath on different days. So fine, let's move the Sabbath from Saturday to Sunday, which is like an absurd argument, but nevertheless, it was debated and discussed very seriously. And in fact, even adopted, but the laity would not accept it. The introduction of organs into the synagogue, all kinds of things which are definitely contradictory to Jewish law, but nevertheless, these like bending over backwards attempts to try and prove that Jews were willing to and appropriate partners in the German national enterprise. David Friedlander, for example, went rather far, and he argued for a so-called dry baptism. This was a proposal he put forth in 1799, realizing that, one of the only ways that Germany seemed to be willing to accept Jews as full members of society is if they would convert. We see this over and over again with great figures like Gustav Mahler, the composer, or Karl Marx's parents, who were all baptized, Heinrich Heine, the great poet, that the only way they could really, get university positions, get reasonable jobs, get published in certain places, and so on, is if they formally adopted Christianity, specifically Lutheranism. So Friedlander said, you know what? Okay, how about this? And he actually wrote an open letter saying, how about all of us Jews convert to Lutheranism? We just want to do it on our own terms, meaning we don't really want to believe that Jesus is our savior, but we will, pro forma say, yeah, sure, we're Lutherans. Yeah. This was why it was a so-called dry baptism. There was no water involved. Of course, it didn't work out, but you see the extent of the desire for the Haskalah to get that elusive German citizenship, that they would do anything for it. And Haskalah was like stretched out way beyond anything that Mendelssohn himself would have approved of. And just to put this in context, since this is the audience we're speaking to, there were genuinely Orthodox figures who found a way to kind of thread this needle. One of the most famous is Samson Raphael Hirsch, who in the middle of the 19th century articulated a very controversial strategy, which indicated that one of the things that was necessary was a cleavage of the Jewish population in Frankfurt am Main, the so-called Austritt, where the Orthodox community formally separated from the general Jewish community in the context of Jewish communal structure. This was really quite a radical move. And at the same time, he argued for a full engagement with German society to the furthest extent that halakha would allow. And this is essentially the essential genesis of what would later be called modern Orthodoxy. A lot of things happened between Hirsch and the 21st century, but the idea of trying to find a safe middle ground between outright assimilation and an obscurantist, insular kind of Judaism that doesn't recognize the value of modern science, modern thought, or non-Jewish civilization. That's sort of where Samson Raphael Hirsch was trying to focus his efforts. And in case you think he wasn't sufficiently religious, this photo was often circulated with a little bit more rich beard, so he looked a little bit more frum, so to speak, in these pictures. Anyways, that's a little bit of a joke. Let's go on. That's what's going on in Western Europe, right? You have these maskilim, the adherents of the Haskalah, who are trying very hard to achieve certain political goals, and they are willing, along a spectrum, they're willing to go so far as even have a kind of a mock conversion if that will get them what they want. They were unsuccessful. Eastern Europe, on the other hand, was rather different. One of the most important ways in which Eastern Europe was different is that it was way more populated by Jews. Russia proper, that is Russia before the expansion under Catherine the Great, was actually closed to Jews from the 15th century onward. But when Catherine expanded the region right around this time in the 18th century, she actually ended up inheriting a massive population of Jews, which she promptly sequestered in a region called the Pale of Settlement, which basically extended from halfway through Latvia all the way down to the Black Sea, encompassing the southern half of Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, a big chunk of Poland, Ukraine, Western Ukraine in particular, and Bessarabia. These were all the regions of the Pale of Settlement, and there was a massive Jewish population there that far outpaced both the absolute number of Jews in Western Europe and also their concentration. Jews were heavily concentrated in medium-sized villages all the way up to cities in Eastern Europe. As you can see, the black dots indicate cities with over 50% Jewish population in 1900. It was a little bit less so at the time period we're discussing because there was an unusual population boom that especially affected Jews over the course of the 19th century. But nevertheless, you get a sense of the difference in scale because of the massive number of Jews that lived in Eastern Europe as opposed to the West. Also, we should understand that there's a huge difference in the political, cultural, and linguistic context of these regions. Germany was regarded by Jews as kind of like the most civilized country in the world. This was the country that had the best scientists, that had the most sophisticated poets, and they had the most wonderful composers, Beethoven, Bach. I mean, all these things are happening in Germany, Goethe, and so on. They're like so excited for Germany. Russia, by contrast, Jews were not especially engaged with it at all. As I mentioned a second ago, Russia proper was actually closed to Jews, so Jews couldn't live in St. Petersburg or in Moscow unless they had special permission because they were especially wealthy and they were involved in commerce or they were talented medical professionals. Otherwise, the vast majority of Jews lived among the large non-Russian populations that were part of the Russian Empire, the Ukrainians, the Poles, the Lithuanians, the Belarusians, and so on. And their cultures, especially their literary cultures, were way behind what was happening in Germany. The Dostoevskys, the Tolstoys, and so on were just the beginning of the huge rush of great Russian literature, but that was happening, towards the end of the period that we're talking about. So it was, Jews were just not attracted to these things. There was no real desire to assimilate to Russian culture, which is, quite different from what you had in Germany. Furthermore, Jews living in this huge swath of territory, the Pale of Settlement, had massive linguistic affinities with each other in the Yiddish language, which was so strong there and not at all a minority language among Jews that it actually evolved eventually into a distinct movement of its own. And any kind of like challenge to traditional authority, religious authority that you would find with the Haskalah in Western Europe, in Eastern Europe, it tended to move away from assimilation and more into acculturation. And it was expressed in movements that we understand today because they were incredibly influential. Yiddishism, right? The whole, engagement with Yiddish literature, Shalom Aleichem, Mendel Sforim, the culture of it and so on that translates really to Broadway and to Hollywood. Zionism, the great political experiment of the Jews that was heavily weighted towards the demands of Eastern Europe, and Jewish socialism, the Bund, the Arbeiterring, and of course, elements of Jews in the Communist Party, the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks and so on. These are things that happen because the Jews are in such great numbers and not especially attracted to Russian culture. They linguistically, they either doubled down on Yiddish or they explored Hebrew. They generally did not say, hey, let's all speak the vernacular, Ukrainian. A little bit different in Poland. There was a much stronger level of Polish Jewish synthesis than you had, let's say, Jewish Lithuanian or Jewish Ukrainian, but nothing like the German Jewish synthesis that really drove the Haskalah. So as these ideas of the Maskilim start seeping over into Eastern Europe, Eastern Europeans, even those who are inclined towards these ideas, they're not deeply impressed. They say, no, we don't want to do it like that. Are you serious? A dry baptism? That's what you expect of us? No way. But they internalized it in other very different ways. For example, Joseph Perl, one of the important misnagdim of the era, one of the important Maskilim of the era, and you can see right away he's wearing a kippah, a very large kippah, even larger than my own, in fact. But he embodies this view saying, okay, listen, with a lot of great things going on in Western Europe and science, and maybe they'll get emancipated and things like that. He looks around at what's going on in Eastern Europe and he says, what's holding us back? He says, oh man, it's those Hasidim. They are the worst. The Misnagdim, okay, they're religious obscurantists and so on, but at least they're rationalists. At least they, have a logical system and they're very sober and they are punctual and they have all of these kinds of values. The Hasidim are wild men. They are drinking, they're dancing, they're singing, they're practicing all kinds of behaviors that we're not used to. All of those things that the Misnagdim I discussed last week were really, offensive, were offended by in Hasidism. And so he took a really unusual tack. He composed false Hasidic books, which were designed to be parodies of Hasidim, that is satires. He wrote a book called Megarat Mirim, which means the revealer of secrets, which was meant to be read as if it were an actual Hasidic book. But when you read it, you would say, oh my gosh, these Hasidim are such fools, such idiots. Ironically, he ended up really preserving a lot of tremendously interesting Hasidic ideas. Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, who was one of his most, he hated Rabbi Nachman more than most. A lot of the famous stories of Rabbi Nachman were recorded because Joseph Perl put them in his own book. So he, strangely enough, did a service for Hasidism by opposing them. And the thing is, people like Joseph Perl, even though he was a dedicated educator and he made tremendous contributions to the general education in Tarnopol in Western Ukraine, nevertheless, he simply could not get any serious traction with his opposition to Hasidism, especially through this strange device of writing these parodies of Hasidic thought. But you see how the Haskalah here, especially in the figure of Joseph Perl, tries to corrode support for Hasidism, but it is a genuinely popular folk movement that people enjoy. people want to be associated with the Hasidim. We should note that Perl was not the only maskil who dealt with the Hasidim, and there were some. I'll show you one in about 10 minutes that viewed the Hasidic movement with quite a bit more charity, but nevertheless, the basic attack of Haskalah on Eastern European Jews was primarily focused at the Hasidim, because they saw them as the most obscurantist, the most anti-rational, the most diametrically opposed to the values of Haskalah that they were trying to slowly bring into Eastern Europe. The fights over Hasidic literature really died down around the year 1815 for various reasons. For example, the Vilna Gaon had now been dead for almost 20 years, and there are also changes in the generations of Hasidic leaders and so on, and the placing of Hasidic rabbis in official positions in many cities calmed down a lot of that intense literary debate. But the Hasidim and the Misnagdim together faced a much more significant threat from the Russian government. And so another element of the Haskalah's attack on the traditionalist lifestyle in Eastern Europe was specifically through the government. And this, in many ways, poisoned relations between, on the one hand, the Misnagdim and the Hasidim, and on the other hand, the Maskilim coming in from Germany. But ironically, this meant that the Hasidim and the Misnagdim had common cause against the Haskalah. And so to a large degree, this helped form what we might call today a Haredi bloc of Litvaks and Hasidim, because they both saw the Haskalah as an existential threat, which they were. Tsar Nicholas I here, who was one of the most influential tsars to rule Russia, had a lot of ideas about how to deal with the Jewish people. He was deeply disturbed that they should not conform to his threefold theory of good government in Russia that emphasized, worship of the Tsar, that emphasized Russian Orthodoxy, which the Jews could not conform to. Obviously, Russian Orthodox Christianity, not Russian Orthodox Judaism. And finally, the idea of narodnost, which means peoplehood or peopleness. He wanted Russian citizens of the Russian Empire, to kind of coalesce around the Russian nationality. And the Jews were like an indigestible mass that could not be absorbed. So he tried a twofold solution to try and divest the Jews of their alien narodnost, and at the same time their alien Judaism, and hoping that that would bring them into the Russian fold per se through a form of assimilation. The carrot element of this was in the form of the Crown Schools, which was a network of Russian-sponsored schools that enrolled Jewish children and, purported to use the Haskalah methods of education to enlighten them and to expose them to science and the Russian language and all kinds of things like that. This is one of the reasons why the yeshiva at Volozhin closed down, was specifically over whether or not the students there would have to learn Russian. And it's clear that it's not because they felt that the Russian language was somehow completely, divorced from everything Jewish, but that they felt that it was the leading edge of much worse things. They brought in maskilim like Max Lilienthal, who initially tried to set up these so-called crown schools, but when it was discovered by Lilienthal and others that in fact these were like very thinly veiled attempts to actually convert Jewish children to to Russian Orthodoxy, with actually priests working on the payroll and so on. Lilienthal ended up giving up, and he actually retired here to America, where he made a career here. And this was the carrot, enrolling kids, Jewish kids, in the Crown schools. The stick was that if you didn't enroll your child in the officially Russian-sponsored school, then your child would be exposed to the Russian army under the so-called Cantonist system. Beginning in 1837, Nicholas I said that Jewish children as young as age 12, legally, in reality, many children younger than the age of 12 were taken, would be conscripted into the Russian army. Now, there's a lot more to say about this terrible decree. It had a tremendously corrosive impact on the Jewish leadership in the communities as well. But it was essentially a death sentence, Jewishly, for the Jewish boys who were taken off to the Tsar's army. One thing that many people don't realize is that service in the Tsar's army was 25 years in length. And Nicholas I, recognizing that conscripting adults at 18 years old, Jewish adults at 18 years old, they were already so steeped in Jewish thought and culture and family connections, they might even be married at this point, they would never completely assimilate. So that's why he backed it off by an additional 6 years, at which point they would have 6 years of military education, and then they would serve their 25 years in the Tsar's army. A horrific thing, these children be taken away from their families, and you can see the desperation in this contemporary Russian painting describing the removal of the Cantonisten. So the Jews of Russia had this terrible choice: either put their kids in these Russian-sponsored, basically conversionist Haskalah schools, or they can expose them to the risks of being sent off to the Tsar's army and not really seen again for decades. This is the reason why, I'm here. My grandfather, Oliver Shalom, did not want to fight against the Japanese in the Russo-Japanese War on behalf of the Russians, and so he made his way to Canada. And about 70% of Ashkenazi Jews in America trace their origins back to this particular period in history as well. You have a lot of shenanigans with Jews mutilating themselves by shooting off toes, children being adopted by other families, so they would be considered as only sons, mixing up ages of births and all kinds of things that occurred during this period. But under these circumstances, the Misnagdim and the Hasidim realized that they had much greater enemies in the Russian government itself and in the Maskilim, who were penetrating into the Russian government and using their position to try to, in their own way, their own misguided way, to enlighten the Jews, and using state power to do so. So this coalesced in a kind of two-front battle. But not everyone agreed with this general assessment. There were some exceptional figures, like Eliezer Tzvifel here, who was a maskil, who, unlike Joseph Perl, did not agree with the excoriation of the Hasidim. And in reality, he took kind of an elevated approach to the three-way conflict that was developing. And I'd like to just close with a quote from a book he wrote called, appropriately, Shalom al Yisrael, in which he writes, God saw that there would be three shepherds, Rabbi Eliyahu in Lithuania, this is the Vilna Gaon, to safeguard the Torah, to purify the Talmud, and to oversee its logic and its diligent study. The Hasidim in Volhynia, which is in southern Poland, western Ukraine, to marshal devotion and to fan the embers of feeling, right? Because the Misnagdim in Lithuania, like they say in Yiddish, kalt via Litvak, cold as a Lithuanian, they have a phenomenal sense of logical power and reason and so on, but they're cold, they're like very tachlis oriented. What is the detail? And very focused on the argument. The Hasidim, on the other hand, are so warm, and maybe they're not quite as demanding about what's happening around the edges, and they're much more inclusive, and they're much more into, for example, prayer. The founder of the Chabad Hasidim said he went to the Magid in order to learn how to pray. Didn't learn to learn Hasidic thought. He went to learn how to pray because they prayed with great devotion. And they prayed with enthusiasm. Hasidic Verbringen is a wonderful thing. And finally, the great sage of our people, Moses ben Menachem, that's Mendelssohn, in Germany, and called him to place the cradle of enlightenment in the lamp of religion, and argued in this regard that, a lot of the ideas that we began with today with Azaria Del Rossi, really conforming to that Maimonidean thought of listening to the truth and accepting it from whoever speaks it, can be valuable for the Jews, and in fact allows the Jews in the 19th century to really excel in so many areas of human endeavor. But I have to conclude with Shalom Al Yisrael, because I identify very much with this idea of different magnetic polarities that affect the Jewish people, alternating between that austere religious text-based thought and the divine enthusiasm of religious ecstasy, and the open-minded rationalism of modernism. These three ideas really inform quite a bit of the Jewish community today. And I think it is the diversity of thought and the multiplicity of perspectives that really helps the Jews exist as a community and as a people in America and the world. Thank you very much for your attention and your endurance over these 3 weeks. It was really a great honor to speak with you. And I guess I should be quiet now and hand it over to Rabbi Posey. Who I think has to unmute himself. Or maybe not. How about?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right, there you go. I began by thanking you. I want to conclude by thanking you. We really appreciate really wonderful, fascinating presentation. Wanted to share a couple questions that came in as we still discuss. One is interesting. Do you see anything of the enemy of my enemy is my friend in terms of the sort of a combined enmity that the Hasidim and Mitnagdim had for some of the Maskilim in their thought, and how that impacted their interaction with each other?
Absolutely, 100%. Excellent question, and we see it functionally as well. I mean, a lot of the organized movements that spoke for Eastern European Orthodoxy tended to be joint movements of both Misnagdim and Hasidim. Agudas Yisrael, for example, Moetzes Gedolei HaTorah, you'll see Streimels and Fedoras sitting side by side, largely because of the much greater threat to their shared way of life that the Haskalah represented. I mean, just think about it for a second. The Misnagdim and the Hasidim are arguing about, whether the knife, what kind of knife do you use for shchita, and a lot of Maskilim are saying, why keep kosher? So they're so much closer than they are from many of the Maskilim and their ideas coming from the West. But the Maskilim are also well-meaning. They believe sincerely that modernizing the Jews is the way forward for them. It's just that when translated into the Eastern European environment, it can be really dangerous for literal safety of the Jews there.
Can I ask a question? Rabbi,
you're the moderator.
Go ahead, Adina, please go ahead.
Okay. I mean, it's hard to formulate because we're looking in hindsight, but I'm just curious. I mean, I understand from the Hasidim and the Mitnagdim, their thing, but did the Maskilim have any interest? Like, they thought that was the way forward for the Jews, but in terms of, now we can see in terms of Jewish continuity, like, that their method might not have been the strongest.
So yeah, a very valid perspective. I think that the Maskilim that had the most impact on Jewish continuity were those who concentrated less on breaking down things that existed and more on developing things that were new. For example, Zionism, right? That in Eastern Europe, Zionism, although there was a segment of the traditionalist population that believed in settling the land of Israel, The idea of political Zionism was foreign to them. And it was the Maskilim who said, yeah, this is exactly what we should be doing. We should be working for a state in Israel. We should be developing the Hebrew language, things like that. And so that's probably the greatest example of where the Maskilim had success, at least viewed over the perspective of 200 years. But they can only do it by ceasing to attack the existing norms of the existing populations, in my humble opinion.
Another question that came in, thank you. It seems that we can point our fingers today at the spiritual heirs of the Hasidim and Mitnagdim. Are there any movements today that philosophically define themselves by the values that underpinned the Maskilim?
Well, that's a great question. I would say yes, but I would think that, in the scope of a brief lecture like this, we haven't been able to really look at the full spectrum of Haskalah. There are many, many different ways to take it, but it's a little bit like chicken soup, in that, if you get a bowl of chicken soup, and it's delicious, aromatic, the color is so appealing and so on, but it's really too hot right now. So you put in an ice cube, and that makes it a little bit easier to take, but the ice cube is still too much. So you got to put in another ice cube. At some point, if you keep adding ice cubes, you're not going to have chicken soup anymore. So that's kind of like the far end of Hasidism, of the Haskalah. At the close end, where you have more chicken soup than you have ice cubes, that's when you have more like Jewish content than you have modern Western European thought. So we have a lot of movements that are on that spectrum. I'm hesitant to name names, but if you look at denominations, certainly the Reform and the Conservative and certain left areas of the Orthodox movements have elements of Haskalah thought. Look, we're having this conversation in English, right? We're not having it in Hebrew or in Yiddish. That in itself is a value of the Haskalah, the mastery of the vernacular, which I've attempted to do, even though I pronounce it with a Canadian accent, right? That's the first thing. Look at the way I'm dressed, I'm wearing a tie, which the Hasidim call a goyish azach, right? Only non-Jews wear a tie because it is not a functional article of clothing. And technically speaking, you're not supposed to wear clothes just to imitate non-Jews. There's a joke about this, by the way. You know how the Hasidim wear a gartel, that like a second belt around their waist, right? It's typically a long cord. And the reason for that is because the Talmud says you have to separate your heart from your genitalia. And so there's a symbolic separation before you go into prayer. So the Hasidim say that the reason why Litvaks wear a tie is to separate their heart from their genitalia, right? That their heart is only their brain, and their physical heart is, somewhat less so. I think it's late for me, so I'm going a little bit further outside. So I would say definitely that virtually every movement, you would have to go to really extreme places, deep in Borough Park or in Muncie or in Bnei Brak, to find any Jews who are not a little bit affected by the Haskalah.
One last question. I think you may have addressed this, which is, you mentioned a couple of figures who believed certain philosophies, but their children or grandchildren did not follow in that path. Was that a common thing that we saw within the big figures of the Haskalah?
Yes.
That was a common phenomenon of the Haskalah. It is a very difficult thing to plant your flag. This is Rabbi Yaakov Trump likes to say, this is my Rav here in New York. Very hard to plant your flag in the middle of a territory. It's easy to plant your flag and say, I'm for this extreme or I'm for that extreme. But if you want to plant your flag in the middle, it's very hard to maintain that position over generations. It's a struggle that I feel very deeply.
With that, I don't know if there are other questions, feel free to ask, but I just want to, on behalf of Beth Jacob, on behalf of our community, thank you once again, and thank all of those who've joined for this enlightening and exciting discussion. And we look forward to having wonderful opportunities to learn and share together going forward. Thank you so much.